Welcome to the podcast Working. I'm your host, Dan Doriani. The goal of this podcast is to fire the imagination of Christians who long to practice their faith at work. We do this primarily by interviewing people who have a story to tell about the way they practice their convictions as they work. Our guests may be famous or unknown, highly successful, or quietly faithful. We meet doctors, athletes, broadcasters, librarians, presidents, intellectuals, politicians, journalists, leaders of startups, and more. This podcast is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis, which seeks to promote faithfulness in the workplace through education, discipleship, and narratives of believers who apply their faith at work. Today's guest is Jim Talent, a four-time U.S. Congressman and one-term U.S. Senator. He's also an elder in the Presbyterian Church in America. He's an expert on China policy and defense policy, including studies on matters such as bioweapons. Jim, good to be with you again. I always enjoy conversing with you, and I'm very glad to have you in our podcast so some other people who want to practice their faith at work can see how a Christian has gone about that for the last 40 years or so. So let me just ask you, first of all, how did you get involved in politics, and how did you come? I know you were involved in politics before you were a believer, but how did you come to believe that political service, legislative service, policy service was part of God's calling in your life?
Well, I did not do it the way Dan Doriani would have advised me to do it. I did not take an accounting of my gifts, my position in life, and decide what would be my highest and best calling at the time. I was very interested in politics, in part because my family was, the one in which I was raised. My mother in particular really followed politics closely and participated in school board elections and that sort of thing. And so, I come by it honestly. And I got involved in local grassroots Republican Party politics. I was in the Young Republicans. I marched in parades and did that sort of thing. Still enjoy that. I mean, I don't march in parades anymore, but I like grassroots politics. And I came back from Chicago, where I had clerked on a federal court, and a friend of mine who was in the legislature called up and said, hey, this seat out in Baldwin is opening up. You have to live someplace. Why don't you get an apartment out there and investigate whether you want to run? And I did. And I used to say all the time, I said, here's how far ahead I plan. I don't buy green bananas, right? In other words, I just sort of took the opening that was there. And the Lord, of course, in his providence, was guiding me in that fashion.
Yeah, but we would say that God in his providence gave you a mentor.
Yeah. That
you trusted, and you knew enough to trust somebody who actually cared about your project and cared about you and saw something in you.
So maybe I was de facto following the Doriani regimen.
A lot of things we do are intuitively correct, even if we haven't articulated them fully.
Right, and I enjoyed it. The Missouri legislature was still the job I've enjoyed the most. Mm-hmm. Because the districts are very small. There's only like 32,000 people in them. Mm-hmm. And so you did not have to be a pro to run, and you could learn the district and learn the people, and it was very hands-on, and I liked the colleagues that I worked with. And I became the Republican leader after 4 years because the guy who was the leader left. And I wanted to do it, and nobody else really wanted to do it.
Yeah, but to become
I'm probably not. This is not necessarily a campaign speech I'd give, but because it doesn't play me up to great advantage. But I did that and loved it. I really loved it. I ended up working with the Speaker and the Majority Leader, even though we were of opposite parties, and we pretty much ran the House. I mean, we got a good rhythm, and it worked. And that was when I developed my view of what are the rightful prerogatives of the majority in a legislative body and what are the rights, the proper rights of a minority party in a legislative body. And they basically agreed. And so we fought all the time over policy, but we were all upholding the norms of the institution.
So you could function, so you could pass laws.
Exactly.
And get along and compromise
when
it was time to compromise.
And if I can say, Dan, I think this is relevant to today, there's a decline in trust in institutions across the board, including government institutions. And one of the reasons is that if an institution is going to work, the people in it have to understand what their common purpose is in the broadest sense, and what are the norms and protocols that the process norms, if you will, that ought to constrain what they do. And they ought to have equal loyalty to that they have to the policy or substantive outcomes they want. Now, the right analogy for that is professional golfers really, really want to win those tournaments. I mean, Tiger Woods...
But you can't focus on the results. You have to focus on the process.
But a Tiger Woods, if you will, is equally loyal to the rules of golf. Mm-hmm. So I believe people like him and others in golf, I'm just picking that one,
right,
would not cheat to win a tournament.
Because it would ruin the game.
And they're equally loyal to the institution of golf. And so the people who are fans of golf have an awful lot of respect for the tour and for golf because they can see these actors constraining themselves. In other words, that they care. If people see you don't care about the institution, all you care about is the outcome, they're not going to trust the institution.
Exactly. Yeah. So one way we say it in this world is you can't just focus on the results. If you focus on the results and get them any way you can, you end up destroying the rules of the game. What you have to do is look at the process and ask, are you faithful to the process that gets you to the results that you want?
Right. And you want to avoid process fouls.
Yes.
And by the way, you should also want to avoid relationship fouls. And biblically, I think we would say, God cares about means as well as ends.
Exactly.
And in fact, in many contexts, he cares more about means than he cares about ends, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the dominant philosophy of our day is utilitarian. That is, everything's judged by the results. And the Bible has about this much, relatively, about results, and about this much about character and loyalty and faithfulness.
Right. Because the results aren't really up to us anyway, right?
No, I mean, you put up a restaurant and the highway goes through and you're ruined because who knew that the highway was going to go past your restaurant? That happens. Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So I'm going to go back to something you said a minute ago, which is that you were I'm not trying to get you to boast here, but, within 4 years, you were in a significant leadership role. So I would like to ask you the question, what do you think God gave you? And one of the big ideas about calling is Jesus' word, to whom much is given, much is required. That little word required actually is the word the Bible uses for recalling a loan. Oh. So whatever gifts you have are yours, but they're ultimately God's, and they're given so you'll do something constructive with them. So they're your gifts from God for the common good. So what did God give you in your opinion? How did God, even before you're a believer, in your mother's womb shape you so that you could be recognized as someone who could help our political process?
Okay, I think I'm pretty good, if you want us to talk about gifts.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'm pretty good at understanding or being situationally aware, to use a military term, of how the platforms in which I'm participating operate.
Okay.
So I get to understand them very quickly and learn how to maneuver within them to achieve a certain result. I deliberately use words like maneuver. Whittaker Chambers said, to live is to maneuver. And another very famous person, the Lord Jesus, said, when he sent them out, be as shrewd as serpents, right? But as innocent as doves. And so what he's saying is learn the rules of the game and the institution and environment where you're operating and maneuver effectively to produce the results that you've thoughtfully decided are the best ones, but do it in a way that, this goes back to what we said before, has respect, right, for the rules of the game, if you will, including first and foremost God's rules. So I'm pretty good at that. I'm a lawyer, and lawyers learn also how to recognize quickly what they need to know to make a decision and how to learn it quickly, which is really important in government because you have to deal with a broad range of issues. So one of the things I loved about it is that in a given day, I might deal with Medicaid issues, criminal justice issues, small business issues, security issues. You're not going to become a scholar in all those areas. So you have to learn what you have to know about those areas to make the decisions you need to make. And I got pretty good because I got pretty good at making decisions and not letting it tear me to pieces, not sweating every one. So you're in a legislative body in the course of a given year, you may vote, I mean, it depends on the session, you may vote 500 times. You cannot sweat every one of those votes to the end. You can't let it tear you to pieces. My dad gave me that advice when I was growing up. He said when he started his law firm, he said he'd toss and turn all night long about things, and he said it was killing me. And I just learned you make the decision and you go on. Yeah. Now there's a half a dozen decisions you make in the course of a year that you're going to sweat. Right. But you cannot do that most of the time. And I hear you do the best you can. And of course then eventually I put that in a biblical context, which is, we're to do the best we can, abiding with the Lord every day, and then at the end of the day, ideally, sort of wash our hands of the day, leave the results to Him, and then go on to the next day. That's why the Lord said, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, right? Yeah.
We go back to a couple,
one
you're
of the
always saying things that are interesting.
One other thing, Dan, is, and I actually like most of the people I've met in politics on a personal level. Yep. And I never really thought about it, but in looking back on my career, I think it really helped me. And I see people in politics all the time deliberately being unlikable. Yes. Now, you shouldn't be a hypocrite, and you shouldn't be a flatterer. Right. But this is true in life, isn't it? I mean, why do you go around deliberately trying to offend people on a personal level? I mean, apart from the fact it's not right, what does that get you? All it does is create people who now want to get you.
Well, maybe it creates posturing and allows fundraising for extreme causes. Let me go back to...
That's very short-term thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to challenge yourself to accomplish those kinds of results in a way that doesn't create a bunch of negatives for you. See, I think that's the easy way out, right? It's like lying in response to a tough question from a reporter. Yes. You may or may not get past that interview, but eventually it's going to catch up with you. So what you have to do is challenge yourself to prepare beforehand so you can answer the tough question without doing things like that.
Yeah, which is back to the quotation about being as guileless or innocent as doves, which, probably means be shrewd. You don't volunteer self-damaging information, and you don't say things that will needlessly harm your cause, but to be as innocent or guileless as a dove includes the idea that you don't lie to get your ends, you don't deceive people, and sometimes you have to say, look, no matter how unpopular this sounds, this is where I stand.
Right.
And that gets you respected. So just to shift...
Although you never say those words. No matter how much the people may not like it, you don't have to say that. Yeah. You just say, look, what you might do is it depends on the issue and how you're approaching it. Right. You have to be confident. Yes. If you're going to say something that people are not going to like, you need to be confident and authentic in it. And in my opinion, you do it without suggesting that people who disagree with you are stupid, or you want to come across in your tone as inherently reasonable. Mm-hmm. So the people listening who disagree with you say, well, at least I think he's sincere in that. Yes. And at least he's thought about it. Yes. And by the way, voters will very often, usually, cut you some slack if you come across that way.
Well, they don't expect their politician to agree with them on everything anyway.
No.
So my greatest irritation with politics has to do with dishonesty. And in the advertisement season, and a few years ago, it was all about Medicare. So-and-so voted to cut Medicare benefits 567 times. And my opponent voted to cut aid to the poor, the needy, and the crippled 327 times. I just turn that off immediately. And when I hear that, I actually think I'm not voting for this person. Because the only way that you get to 300 votes is by counting every procedural and by paying no attention to the rationale for the position they took. I'm sure that you have something to say about.
Yeah, I'll give you a story. I mean, when I was
Political
in the Senate, my friends on the other side of the aisle, we would vote on budget bills. I won't go through all the process.
Yeah.
But they would offer, in essence, the same amendment to increase funding for the Veterans Administration and VA health
Right.
over and over and over again. Now, I was always a believer in funding VA health,
Sure.
and we funded substantial increases every year in VA health. But you can't double the VA health budget every year. So I would, at a certain point, begin voting against those things, and then that enabled them to come back and say,
Jim
in the
Talent
campaign,
voted
voted X
against.
number of times.
Exactly.
That's politics.
Yes.
I mean, I don't resent that. You know, they know what they're doing. I know what they're doing.
See, I thought it
My
corrupted the
side has
public
done-
discourse because it implies that, Jim Talent or whoever, Joe Smith, is a vile person who hates orphans, widows, and veterans who are disabled. I thought it debased the discourse and therefore made it harder for us to approach issues rationally and confidently. And in the public realm, not that we expect to agree on everything, but to have a civil discourse. I thought
Well,
that
but see,
undercut that.
when you say it's debasing the discourse, you assume that the norm for the standard of discourse is higher. It's not debased. That is the discourse. Okay? So, and what you have to have, I think, to be able to function in what I used to do without enormous amounts of anxiety or bitterness, whatever, is to have some faith in the voters. Okay? I don't think they moved the vote with those. I really don't.
They sure ran them a lot. Somebody must have thought they worked.
Well, you have to run something. See, this is another thing I tell people. Well, why are they saying that? And so, well, I have to say something. Lots of times it's a process of elimination. I can't address this issue because it's what's my coalition. I can't say this because it'll be too easy to expose. So what is it I can talk about? That's one of the reasons you hear so much about the minimum wage. And again, I really don't want to, that's just the first thing that sprang to mind. That is a very safe topic for a Democrat to talk about.
Because you're caring for the
Right.
disadvantaged.
Right, exactly.
Or
And
you
because
seem to be
it's
anyway.
popular,
Yes.
and your whole base supports it, et cetera. And I could give similar examples on the Republican side,
Sure.
right? So, but you have to have some faith that the voters will sort this thing out. And particularly, now look, when you run for office, unless you're running in a which I did in the legislature, my district was so solidly Republican. I used to tell people there were 163 seats. I used to tell people if there were only one Republican seat, it would be mine. But in a typical constituency, there's 40% of the people who are not going to vote for you.
No matter what.
It doesn't matter.
And there are 40% who will vote for
Right,
you.
and so what those ads do is they give that set of people the reason they will tell their friends that year that they're not voting for talent. Because one of the things that's unusual in our democracy is most people do not like to simply say what is true in 80% of the cases. I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. So, I'm not voting for talent because I'm a Democrat. I'm not voting for Claire McCaskill because I'm a Republican. So I got to have a reason, and the one that's on the front of my mind is usually the one that the people in my party have been talking about.
Which
I
is
don't
safe
want
to talk about and popular.
and
to
which
talk
people
about.
believe, and they're not
Right,
lying,
yeah.
right? And so, we don't like, even partisans don't like to say they're partisan in this country. That's not true in parliamentary systems.
Right.
In Britain, I'm a Tory. I'm a Labor. I wear the rosette that says I'm a Labor person, right? What is it over there? I think the color is red for Tories over there, or for Labor. We don't do that here.
Yeah.
So we come up with other reasons.
Oh, that's fascinating. You are educating me, and I'm glad of it. What I would like to do is talk a little bit more explicitly about what a believer should expect from politics. And you have a saying that you and I have talked about, and that is that we say a democracy, what we mean, of course, is a republic.
A constitutional
A
republic.
constitutional republic. But in ordinary parlance, we
It's
say a
okay to
democracy.
call it a democracy.
Yeah, exactly. So a government, the government we get in a democracy is pretty much the one we deserve, or if you don't like your leaders, hey, guess what? You elected them.
Right.
Explain what that means, and explain what it means for a Christian who might be enthusiastic or maybe concerned about politics.
I guess what it means is that over time, the policies and actions on a substantive level of the government reflect, at least they operate within limits that are set by the basic preferences and impulses of the electorate as a whole. So in politics, you are maneuvering within, there's a word maneuver again, from a policy standpoint, you are maneuvering within limits that are and should be set by the people. And the people should have the kind of government that they want, over time. And they usually, if they want something badly enough over time, they get it. Now, when I was in the legislature, and it's usually, by the way, as I said before, I have a, and still do, have a faith in the people of the country. I still say about elections, even the ones I lost, I look back on it and I said, I've said this to you too. I didn't like losing, but I understood the rationale for it. They were acting rationally as a whole in terms of how they defined the interests that were important to them.
The issues of the day.
Yeah, which wasn't necessarily how I would have defined it,
Right.
but they're the ones who get the right to do that,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
It's really very important. So, you may be Rand Paul and believe in a very libertarian vision of the government, but the people don't want you to get rid of Medicare. I'm not saying Rand. I should have said Ron, maybe, his father.
Any libertarian.
Okay, any libertarian.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So when I was running for governor, when I was in the legislature, I voted against legalizing gambling in the state or extending the legalization of gambling where it existed, because I thought that it was, in the long run, self-defeating even from a revenue standpoint, that it would cost more. And I also thought it was a regressive form of taxation because...
And it is, because the poor disproportionately purchase lottery
Particularly the
tickets
lottery,
and
right.
Lottery, but also to some extent gambling, and there's problem gamblers, of course.
Right, exactly.
Which cost the state a lot of money to...
Yeah, the costs are hidden.
Right.
The benefits are up front.
Exactly.
But the people voted in different ballot issues like 3 or 4 times.
So
And
it's the
when
law
I
of
was-
the land.
Yeah, and I was running for governor, and I never got a chance to use this line publicly. But I would tell my staff when we were gathering to talk about politics, I said, look, I'm running for governor, not dictator.
Mm-hmm.
This is what they've said they wanted. And they're entitled. So what I said was, I'm going to try and make the system they have created here work as well as they want it to work. We're going to have honest administration of the gambling laws. We're going to listen to what the gambling interests want, but we're not going to let them control these commissions and the rest of it, which can happen.
Right.
Okay? Because I'm not running for dictator. I'm running for governor, okay? And at the end of the day, we have to let people choose the basic course of the country they live in. It's from a political standpoint. Obviously, God is. It's owing to them. It's a respect to them as people. It's a respect to the basic premise of our government, which is the only just government is one that derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Okay. Now, if you can't go along with it as a matter of conscience,
You shouldn't run for political office.
You shouldn't be in. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, let me just give a hypothetical. If you had become governor for 8 years and you kept noticing the effects of gambling and could demonstrate that it was a regressive tax, especially lotteries, and then that gambling, the number is actually about 3% of gamblers become problem gamblers, and tears apart families, and people fall into destitution, divorce, children are torn mother from father, etc. You would have been perfectly glad as governor to point out that this system is not serving the Commonwealth. And you would have then tried to persuade them to
right,
that
exactly.
effect.
Now the issue is how big is your bandwidth as a leader,
Right.
and how high a priority is that relative to other things.
Right.
Okay, you can't do everything, but if you decided that it was a priority, then that's exactly how you would go about it. And what you want to do is you want to set up a system of discussion and debate over the thing that reasonable people on both sides of it looking at it would say, that's a reasonable way. That's a reasonable way of looking at it. They're having a reasonable discussion, which means again that as a leader, if you're going to try and persuade them, you have to challenge yourself to learn your brief, as lawyers would say, in a way that you can honestly persuade them and with respect, right? And again, you think of the biblical example. Even on something as important as the kingdom of God, what does it say? Was it 1 Peter? I think it is. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. Learn your brief.
Right.
But do it. And when asked, always be ready when asked. I screwed up scripture. Always be ready when asked to give a reason for the hope that lies within you. But do it with what? With gentleness and respect.
And a little bit later, Peter says, don't be surprised at the fiery trial that comes upon you, because when you give your brief, people may not like it. And in that culture, of course, giving your brief for Christ might mean dissing the emperor to some degree. Yeah. But, they asked, and you're on the defensive.
Right.
And so you give a reason for your convictions.
God respects people. He respects his creation. I mean, he values people, and we ought to value people too.
Yeah. Let's stick with this topic of what's possible in politics. So, as you surely know, the abortion rate has dropped in Missouri a great deal over the last number of years, essentially absent legislation. I mean, there's been some legislative action to some degree, but mostly it's been it's been moral suasion that's moved the abortion rate from 23% down to about 7% today. And that's happened in a variety of states. You and I both know that a lot of people would like to take a legislative approach to abortion. And some Christians would like all Christian politicians to say absolutely no to all abortions, no matter what. On the other hand, your approach, as I understand you, is you're principle driven, but politics is also the art of the possible. Don't go for something you'll never get. Don't go for something that violates the will of the great majority of the people, because even if you win legislatively in the short run, it'll be overturned before long.
Right.
So walk me through how, you don't have to use abortion. We could use abortion or gambling or anything else. How does a Christian politician go for as much as he or she possibly can to bring God's will to pass in the public realm? And I understand it's within the realm of suasion and not trying to force our convictions on others, which is contrary to our whole American system. But how do you go for as much as you can? And you've kind of answered that already.
Well, I think there's a very key thing to keep in mind, and this is true in any endeavor. It's true church planting, building up a church, and anything else. You have to identify, you have to have a strategy. And so I've learned a lot from my work with the military and in military issues, okay? So strategy is choosing the highest order ends and also choosing the highest order means that you're going to use to accomplish those ends, and then building a plan around that. So what is the strategic goal if you decide to get involved in politics and make the pro-life issue your objective? So what is that goal? Is it to pass a law? Passing a law may be a means to the goal. The goal is to have as few abortions as possible, I would suggest to you, right?
Absolutely.
Now, there is a political side to this, but it's not the only thing. And the political side, in order to get the most political constraints that you can get, and of course you're right, you're going for the best result that is possible, not the best result possible in a different world than the one you're in. And there's so many biblical examples of this. Again, I tend to multiple digressions, but Joseph ended up having to actually allow the people to be sold into slavery, because that was the best result possible for the people.
To avert starvation.
Yeah, at the time. It wasn't what
Right.
Joseph, I assume, wanted to do.
Right.
But it was within the parameters that God gave him to operate in, right?
Or Obadiah, who served Ahab, the worst king Israel ever had.
Right.
Because he could rein in the wickedness. Did he get everything he wanted out of Ahab? The answer is certainly not.
No.
But he saved a lot of prophets, and he got his hands dirty.
Right,
In the
exactly.
process. Yeah.
And actually, our Lord himself, there are many examples where he is maneuvering effectively. I used to say to people who wondered why I didn't just hammer a message directly sometimes, I would say to them, how did our Lord teach a lot of the time?
Parables.
In parables. He adjusted, he never changed the substance of the message, but he adjusted the way he delivered it to the audience he was talking to.
And parables are especially helpful for people who didn't really want to listen to what he had to say.
Exactly.
And he spoke in parables in situations of high hostility.
So was our Lord a coward? Right. Was he a person who was a hypocrite? No. I mean, he did, and he explained himself why he did it, right?
Right.
Okay, so where was I? So you identify what the goals are, and then you say, okay, there's a political side. There's also a tremendously important, which I think the movement has done very well with Birthright and centers like that, right? Helping people. In terms of the political constraints, this is a democracy or republic, which means you're going to be able to go as far. You have to have a political base. You have to be able to sustain everything you do in government with a political base. It doesn't always have to be a majority, but you have to have. You can't do it. You'll be cut off if you try and do it.
Or quickly reversed.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't. So you have to persuade people, and you need to think of the laws you're passing as part of that persuasion process, right? And if you aim, I always felt, if you aim the laws at restricting those aspects of abortion that are worst in the minds of the people in the middle, it gives you a vehicle to talk to them about abortion in general, okay? And they begin to see what it really is. This is why the partial birth abortion ban was so good. Of course, partial birth abortions are terrible,
Right.
but all that did was prohibit a particular means of aborting a late-term baby. But it was very effective because it allowed people to see what abortion is.
What's an 8-month?
It moved public opinion.
Along. Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
so if you
Baby.
pass a law, regardless of what it is, that restricts something in abortion, but it moves public opinion away from you,
Right.
you are retreating, you are regressing in your attempt to achieve the strategic goal. You're not gaining it.
Which is why, and I think you and I would agree on this, if you pushed for laws forbidding abortion for rape and incest, you'll first of all never get it passed, and also you move it out of the realm. You're operating in the wrong realm. So pastorally, if somebody came to me and said, tragically, I've been raped and I'm pregnant, I can get an abortion, right? As a pastor, I would say, what did the child do wrong? Why would you want to? Your situation is horrific, and I empathize with you as deeply as possible, but is the best course of action for you to remove the child because of what the father did? So I can say that pastorally and urge that pastorally. Politically, it's nonsense. You just lose everybody, and you would lose the chance for winning the common consensus. Or winning
Take this on the other side of the political spectrum, because there's a lot of people on the left who at the time criticized, and still do, President Obama because they want government-run health care.
Yes.
And in fairness to them, that actually is the model in most developed democracies, right? I think it'd be terrible, but they're certainly not unreasonable or terrible people for wanting this. And they didn't think Obamacare went anywhere near far enough, okay? But if President Obama was sitting in front of this mic, he would probably say, if I had tried to do what you wanted to do, I would have gotten nothing, number one, and I would have pushed the electorate even further away from the goal that you want. So why would I do that if I'm trying to achieve something in the long run? So a lot of it is defining the strategic goal, which in a democracy, if you're pursuing a political end, always includes moving public opinion in your direction. okay? The civil rights movement, I mean, if you'd asked Martin Luther King, he would absolutely have said this. The reason it succeeded at the end of the day was not because of some particular tactic. It was because you just look at public opinion, beginning the 30s and going to the 60s, and see how it moved. They moved public opinion. And that opened up. So it's one of the reasons I've argued that that Jackie Robinson, along with Dr. King, was probably the most, because when people saw African Americans playing baseball, I mean, baseball was the national
game of the day, right?
See, it persuaded people. And Robinson, that first year he played, he was, he was a very fiery, competitive guy, but he stood there and took it because he knew the goal was to persuade people.
Yeah.
And so that, now, we can all disagree about what the plan ought to be. I mean, there's nothing certain about any of this, but if you don't have the right goal, you're very unlikely to achieve what you want. Right. I don't like it when Christians say you can't be a Christian and not be for laws against abortion. I think you're wrong if you're not, but you actually can. You can have a view of government that says abortion is wrong, but I don't think it's the job of the state to enforce that law. I always took the positions I took on pro-life because I thought it was required by America's political religion. The Declaration. In other words, if an unborn child is a human being, they are entitled to the rights to life. And whenever we arbitrarily read some group of human beings out of the political community, you're a second caste. We have huge trouble, whether it's African Americans during slavery or other groups or women or other groups at other times.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. You can visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis, at faithandworkstl.org. There you can subscribe to our podcast, sign up for our newsletter, learn about our Faith and Work cohorts, leave a message for us, and more.
Our discussion questions for this podcast begin with this question. In your work, how do you navigate the tension between loyalty to outcomes and loyalty to institutions? Part 2 of that, how do you navigate the need to be loyal to process and to have an interest in results, especially since it can seem that they exist in conflict? Second, do you ever have to do unpopular things at work? Do you ever have to say unpopular things? If you're in a position of authority, how do you navigate that? How do you communicate unpopular actions or policies to people under you? And how do you motivate yourself to take unpopular positions?
Join our discussion at facebook.com/faithandworkstl or our Instagram at faithandworkstl. I'm Christina Hanna, Program Director for Center for Faith and Work.